Let's see now. Okay. Charlotte Bronte and the Bible, and looking specifically at Jane Eyre and the way that the Bible is made use of in Jane Eyre. I'm going to start with some background information about the Bronte family and Charlotte Bronte herself, and then we'll launch into the actual novel and how biblical themes get reflected in the novel. So, to start with, it's probably worth knowing a little bit, if you don't know anything about them, it's worth knowing a little bit about the family, what sort of people the Bronte family were. And you can see them here. There aren't very many portraits of them, so this is quite an unusual little family gathering of the children as they've grown up. None of them lived for all that long, but they're a little bit more than just children here. And you've got Emily Bronte, Charlotte Bronte, and Anne Bronte, who all were significant literary figures in their day. And then their poor brother Branwell, who wasn't, and ended up becoming a kind of alcoholic and dropout. And I think having three intelligent sisters was too much for him, to be honest. Charlotte is Charlotte and Emily before Wuthering Heights and Charlotte for Jane Eyre, although she did write other novels. They're mainly famous for those particular two novels. And they grew up pretty much without a mother because their mother died when the children were very young. And there were two other sisters who also died in childhood and had a big impact on Charlotte Bronte. One of them in particular, she felt very close to, and that sister is reflected in one of the characters in Jane Eyre. So this is a little family group. They were basically growing up with their father. And so Charlotte's relationship to the Bible is influenced by her for the simple reason that he was a clergyman. He was unusual because he was very highly educated. He'd come from Ireland and he was somehow very academic. He just came out of the blue, and so the house was filled with books and things like that. But after his wife died, he kind of dedicated himself to being the good Christian, not just reading out the sermons in church on a Sunday like a lot of clergymen did, just doing the basics. He took it very, very seriously, went to visit all the poor people in his parish and went to care for the sick and so on. He gave his life over to being a good Christian, to doing those acts of charity after the death of the mother. And there's another little picture here of Charlotte Bronte showing her at work on her first novel, and her father, who's by this stage not at all well himself, he's sitting in an armchair. And this is taken from Elizabeth Gaskell's Life of Charlotte Bronte. She wrote a biography of Bronte after her death, and it's had a big influence on how we've seen Charlotte, quite possibly mistaken, because she's tried to present her as a very cleaned up kind of image, which may not be exactly the truth, but it emphasizes this kind of thing, the good girl sitting at home writing her novel, with what is probably meant to be the Bible here, partly because it seems to have a clasp, okay, and that clasp was typical for Bibles that would hold it shut when it wasn't being used, so that the pages didn't fly out by accident. And the size and thickness of it kind of looks like a Bible, in which case it may very well be the exact same Bible that belonged to her and was sold at auction in 1909, and which is still in private hands. And there was a little report on it a couple of years ago. When it came, it kind of got lost. Somebody said, "Oh, my dad gave this to me when he died. He said it might be valuable," and it went on to one of his television antique shows, and it came up, "This is worth like £50,000 or something." And the guy said, "Oh, really? It was just an old book my dad gave me." So that's it. Okay. She's got her handwritten notes in it, which scholars would love to get their hands on this book and really go through it in detail and see what sorts of comments she wrote. But as I say, it's in private hands. It hasn't been made available. So we've only got a few pages. We can, we don't really know all the details of what she wrote in there. But that's it. That's her copy of the Bible. And that may be very well what is on that table there while she's working. She grew up with, like most Victorian people, a fairly close relationship to the Bible. I think I mentioned that people would read a chapter of the Bible in the evening. The family would take turns to read a chapter of the Bible, that sort of. And when she was about 8 years old, her father asked her what her favourite book was, and she said the Bible. And when she was asked what her second favourite book was, she said the book of nature. She was growing up in that period, when the Romantic poets were particularly kind of in their first sort of flush of fame, and nature was kind of very central to the Romantic view of the world. And another thing, as a child, she embroidered verses. Embroidery was one of those things that women would do. Little girls would learn how to do it. And you find lots of examples of this kind of embroidery, patiently stitched on winter evenings, probably, by candlelight. They'd sit for hours and do this kind of thing. And this is taken from the book of Proverbs. Okay, it's got practice, it's got letters and just practice stuff here. And then, but my humility and the fear of the Lord are riches, honour and life. And it says Charlotte Bronte finished this sample on the 25th of July at the age of 6. So that's the kind of childhood she would have had, okay? With a clergyman for a father, the Bible is a sort of main text. And this is taken from the book of Proverbs, which is kind of interesting because although it was fairly typical for children to do that kind of thing, little girls, and to embroider biblical texts in that way, but it's interesting that Jane, in Jane Eyre, is so different from Bronte. Bronte seems like a sort of good little girl, and she says her favourite book is the Bible, and she's taking verse from Proverbs to choose as the text, which is, it all suggests a good little girl, an obedient little girl, because the Proverbs are all about kind of obedience, really, or they're largely about rules that you should obey in life and how to behave properly, which little Jane in Jane Eyre is not good at all. She seems like either there's another side to Charlotte Bronte that we're not being told about by Elizabeth Gaskell, and that we, and people are sort of thinking more and more, no, she wasn't really the way Elizabeth Gaskell has painted her in her biography, or else she's giving expression through Jane to everything that she wanted to be, but wasn't. And there's some truth in that way of looking at it as well. Anyway, here we have the little Jane in Jane Eyre. And at the age of 10, she's being asked about the Bible by Mr. Brocklehurst. And she's supposed to be going to school, and Mr. Brocklehurst is the treasurer. He's in an important position in the school that she is supposed to be going to. And he comes to her house to meet her, to see if she's suitable to go to the school. Now, she's growing up with her aunt. She doesn't have any close family. Her aunt is not her blood relation. Okay? She's not nice to her. And little Jane thinks she'd be better off going, even if it's going to be a cheap charity school, she's going to be better off there than with her rather unpleasant aunt. So Mr. Brocklehurst has come and he's asked her about the Bible, and she says her favourite parts of the Bible are Revelations. Well, actually, it should be Revelation. Okay, the S is a mistake. Not my mistake. I mean, it's in. I think I've taken it from the book there. It's often known as Revelations, but that's a mistake. In the Bible, it's actually the book of Revelation without the S, but people popularly call it Revelations with the S. The book of Daniel and Genesis and Samuel, and a little bit of Exodus and some parts of Kings and Chronicles and Job and Jonah. So she's obviously pretty well read in the Bible, but she's pretty picky. She's chosen certain parts of the Bible. What she seems to have chosen is the parts where there's a story going on. All right? But he asks her, what about the Psalms? I hope you like them, he says. And she's very sharp for a little girl of 10. She's very sharp in her reply. She just says, no, sir, Psalms are not interesting. He's deeply shocked. He says, that proves that you have a wicked heart. So she likes those parts of the Bible that tell a story, where there's a conflict, where there's a resolution, a narrative. And of course, the grown-up Bronte wrote stories with a conflict and a resolution. And so she seems to have been attracted, or the Jane that she talks about was attracted to those parts of the Bible that are telling a narrative, that are telling a story. And that's what the Psalms don't do. They're basically about ways to control the emotions. Proverbs as well is sort of about rules for precepts for living your life. They don't tell a story. They don't have a narrative. So Jane's dislike of the Psalms could be seen as a sign of her passionate nature and the fact that she can't control her emotions, which is what made the book so shocking when it was first published. This little girl who's passionate. Little girls were not supposed to be passionate. And as she grows up, she keeps some of her passionate qualities, and that's not, again, it's not what little girls are supposed to be or young women are supposed to be. So the book was seen as rather shocking to some Victorian readers because of its emphasis on passion and strong emotions. And then she goes off to school, and who does she meet? She meets this little girl called Helen, who is a real Bible freak. I mean, she's a real Christian girl, and she's not just, reading the Bible for stories or for excitement, but she totally accepts the Christian message. And they're both students, and they become close friends, and Helen is that little bit older. So Jane admires her, she looks up to this older girl, and they get talking about various things, and Christianity is one of them. So you got the little girls talking about that topic, really, revenge, which I said was so important in the early modern period. It comes back. It's still a basic part of the Bible. Do you forgive your enemies, or do you hate them and fight against them and take revenge and everything? It's still very, even today, isn't it? It's still an important topic, basic topic of what the Bible is all about. So Jane says, well, she's very logical, very clear. If people were always kind and obedient to those who are cruel and unjust, the wicked people would have it all their own way. They would never feel afraid, and so they would never alter. They'd grow worse and worse. If bad people are just say, oh, yes, go ahead, yes, I forgive you, They say, well, shall I kill you? Oh, yes, please do. I mean, I'll forgive you, That's, Jane, you can't just let people get away with doing bad things. They're just going to get worse and worse. They're not going to feel sorry. The only thing to stop them is to make them feel afraid. Okay, when we're struck out without reason, we should strike back again very hard. I'm sure we should. So hard as to teach the person who struck us never to do it again. Right? She's got a very clear idea about that. And that's what she's done with her aunt, and her cousin, John Reed, at the beginning of the story. She's attacked him as a little girl. And it's one of the reasons why she gets sent away to school, because she's so kind of wild. She's not going to accept that kind of behavior. So that's what she's telling Helen. And Helen says, you'll change your mind, I hope, when you grow older. As yet, you're but a little untaught girl. You're just a little girl, and you don't know the world, and you don't know, especially you don't know this kind of Christian truth. You don't know the Bible. You don't know this kind of thing. So Jane is not convinced. I feel this, Helen. I must dislike those who, whatever I do to please them, persist in disliking me. If they don't like me, I don't like them. Why should I? I must resist those who punish me unjustly. Okay, I'm going to fight back. I'm a fighter. That's what I am. It's as natural as that I should love those who show me affection or submit to punishment when I feel it's deserved. Okay, if she feels she deserves it, she'll say, yes, please, punish me, because I was bad. Okay, so I love those who love me, and I accept punishment if I deserve it. But I'm not going to accept unfairness. It's not my way. And again, Helen comes back at her patiently with the Christian teaching. She says, heathens and savage tribes hold that doctrine. Okay, wild people, there's a lot of, in Bronte, basically, the rest of the world is pretty uncivilized for Bronte. We are English and we are Christians, and we do better than that. All right. So Christians and civilized nations don't follow that kind of teaching. We disown that kind of teaching. So Jane is curious about this. What do you mean? What would you talk? How? In what way? I don't understand, she says. So Helen explains, well, it's not violence that best overcomes hate, nor vengeance that most certainly heals injury. What then? Read the New Testament and observe what Christ says and how he acts. Make his word your rule, and his conduct your example. Follow the Bible. It's easy to do. What's your problem here? Why don't you just understand the teachings of the Bible? But what does Christ say? What is this teaching? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and despitefully use you. She's just using the exact words from the Bible here. Well, that's something Jane at this stage can't really accept. She listens to Helen. She thinks, wow, it's great if you can be like that, but she can't be like that. And there's one of the teachers who is particularly nasty towards Helen, seems to be particularly cruel, maybe even takes a kind of sadistic pleasure in hurting Helen. She beats her, and she ties a pasteboard to her head with the word slattern on it as a punishment. Slattern basically, in this case, just means dirty girl, a dirty woman, a dirty girl. It could be used to mean morally dirty, but in those days it mostly meant, I think, physically. That it's because apparently the teacher says she hasn't washed her hands properly and her nails are dirty or something. Well, Helen accepts that patiently, even though it's not fair, but Jane is furious and she tears it off her head and throws it into the fire. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean it to explode quite that badly, but anyway, she throws it onto the fire. And the fury of which she, okay, this is Jane speaking, the fury of which she, meaning Helen, the fury of which Helen was incapable, had been burning in my soul all day. She'd been itching to take that paper and take that pasteboard and throw it onto the fire all day. She'd been furious. And she finally, her fury culminates in her taking it and throwing it onto the fire. And same thing happens when Helen is beaten by Miss Scatcherd, Jane is outraged by this. It seems disgraceful to be flogged, to be beaten, and to be sent to stand in the middle of a room full of people. And you're such a great girl. I am far younger than you, and I could not bear it. And then look at the Stoicism. Remember what we talked about Stoics. Remember the Stoics and think about Helen's response here. It's very much the Stoic. Whoops. Sorry, my email program must be open at the same time. I should have closed that. So the Stoics are reflected in what Helen says. It would be your duty to bear it if you could not avoid it. It is weak and silly to say you cannot bear what it is your fate to be required to bear. You have to. You just have to. That's what being a Christian is. That's what, in fact, even more generally, that's what life is. If you can't, you can't get away from it, you can't escape it, then you have to. You have to bear it. It's silly. It's weak to say you cannot bear it. You just have to. That's life. And it's too much for Jane. I heard her with wonder. I could not comprehend this doctrine of endurance, this Stoic teaching. And still less could I understand or sympathize with the forbearance she expressed for her chastiser. It's bad enough to say you should be patient and accept your suffering, but to say you should forgive the person who's doing it to you, well, that's way beyond anything Jane can understand or accept. Still, I felt that Helen Burns considered things by a light invisible to my eyes. I suspected she might be right and I wrong, but I would not ponder the matter deeply. I didn't want to think too much about it. I thought maybe she's right, but I don't want to think too much about it. I want to live my life in my way. Okay, so she can't accept Helen's way of thinking. But then, you see, Helen dies. And Helen is based in real life on Charlotte Bronte's elder sister, who did indeed die, sent away to a charity school or to one of these cheap schools, boarding schools, and she does indeed die. And Bronte herself, Charlotte Bronte, is in the school, and her elder sister dies there. So very much kind of autobiographical at this stage. And then later on in the novel, Mrs. Reed, the aunt, the great enemy that Jane has in her childhood, or one of her great enemies, she's on her deathbed, and then at that point she remembers Helen. Helen doesn't get mentioned for quite like 100 pages or so. Helen dies, and then a long time later, when Jane has grown up, Jane has got a job, and the message comes that her aunt is dying. So she goes back to her family home 10 years later, and she meets her aunt who's dying. And at that point, she remembers Helen, and Helen comes back into the story in Jane's memory. So I think it's very significant that she comes back at that particular time. And let's look at how it plays out. Because what you've got is this. You've got Aunt Reed, who Jane hated when she was a small child, and who bullied Jane and was nasty to Jane, and locked her up in a little room where she was held prisoner, and harmed her in all kinds of ways. And she's dying. And Jane has come to her deathbed now as a young woman. She's grown up. And this is the first time she's been back to see her aunt since she was a child. She left, she went to school, she never went back. Even during the holidays, she never went back to her aunt's home. And she's sitting there. The rain is beating on the window outside. I don't know if you've ever been to Yorkshire, but it often rains. And it's sort of typical grey kind of feeling and atmosphere. And there's this woman dying in this room. And Jane is sitting there, and she's thinking about it. one lies there, a person lies there who will soon be beyond the war of earthly elements. Wither is just an old word for where. Where will that spirit, now struggling to quit its material tenement, its body, the spirit that's trying to escape from its body, where will it go when it's released, when it's set free? Where do they go when they die? Where do people go? She's just sort of sitting there and thinking about it, looking at this woman who's lying on her deathbed. And in pondering the great mystery, I thought of Helen Burns. It's natural for Helen to come to her mind. I recalled her dying words because she was there right at the end when Helen died, or towards the end. I remembered her faith, her doctrine of the equality of disembodied souls. I thought about Helen in this moment while she's sitting there, her old childhood friend who died when Jane would have been about 11 or 12 years old, I think. She remembers that dear friend. And at that point, Mrs. Reed wakes up and sees Jane and says, "Whoa, you're like Jane Eyre." Well, yeah, there's a reason for that. I am Jane Eyre. So explains that it really is her. And Mrs. Reed hands her a letter. And the letter comes from an uncle of Jane's in Madeira, which is an island off the coast of Africa. It belongs to Portugal. It's a Portuguese island, but it's kind of connected with the British Empire in a way, because the British used it to build up a lot of business interests there, mostly to do with wine. Okay, port. We call it port. It's a type of strong, heavy wine, and that's what Jane's uncle has been doing. He's been in Madeira working in business, and he's written a letter to Aunt Reed. And the contents, again, are explosive. It's big stuff. "Madam, will you have the goodness to send me the address of my niece, Jane Eyre, and to tell me how she is? It's my intention to write shortly and desire her to come to me at Madeira. Providence has blessed my endeavours to secure a competency, and as I am unmarried and childless, I wish to adopt her during my life and bequeath her at my death whatever I may have to leave. I am, madam," etc., etc., John Eyre, Madeira. So, like, the big stuff here is, would you send me the address of my niece? Okay? And he's got a competence, that means he's got money, and he's childless and unmarried. And I wish to adopt her during my life and bequeath her, give her at my death whatever I may have to leave. All right? So that letter totally changes, or should have changed, Jane's life. She should have said, "There's someone who loves me. There's someone in this world who cares about me." And that's all she's ever wanted. I mean, again, in one of her conversations with Helen, she says, "I would give anything, I would cut off my hand, I would do anything to have somebody who loved me." Because nobody has ever really cared for her in her life. Her aunt, in particular, was unkind to her, and she needed that desperately. And that was all she would have wanted, to know that there was an uncle. She wouldn't have cared about the money or anything. It just, there was somebody there who would love her and care about her. And what's happened? Mrs. Reed has kept the letter from Jane out of spite, just out of ijiwaru. She didn't give the letter to Jane. In fact, even worse than that, "I disliked you too fixedly and thoroughly ever to lend a hand in lifting to you to prosperity. I hated you too much. And I said I was sorry for his disappointment, but Jane Eyre was dead." She wrote back and lied and said that Jane Eyre was dead. "Sorry, you can't, you have your dream, but you can't do it. She's dead, she's gone." Wow. How nasty can you get? And now, let's think about this. Let's think about the passionate Jane who screamed at her cousin who screamed at her aunt when she was a little girl, but she's remembered Helen only a few minutes ago, and how does she behave now? If ever there was a reason for her to be angry, she's got every reason to be furious, but she's not. She stays calm. It's Mrs. Reed who's, racked with guilt and, oh, I did this terrible thing and now I'm dying. I've got to tell you, but she's the one who's torn up about it all. Jane is just sitting there calmly and saying, look, it's all right. If you could but be persuaded to think no more of it, Aunt, and to regard me with kindness and forgiveness, please, you're dying. That's bigger than all of this. That matters more. So the angry, revengeful little girl has grown up into a gentle, reasonable young woman. Okay? That's what the novel is showing us at this stage. And the adult Jane is full of that spirit of Christian forgiveness that when she was a little girl, hearing it from Helen, she couldn't understand. My disposition, she says to her aunt, is not so bad as you think. I am passionate, but not vindictive. I mean, I do have a strong feeling about things, but I don't want to be nasty to anybody. I'm not that kind of person. Many a time as a little child I should have been glad to love you if you would have let me, and I long earnestly to be reconciled to you now. Come on, let's make friends finally before you die. All right, so, Jane is the one who's behaving very much as Helen would. Helen would have been proud of her. Or maybe Helen is sort of sitting up there on a cloud, looking down at her as an angel and being proud of her old friend. Kiss me, Aunt. And she wants to make up and be friends with the dying woman. Well, it's not going to work, and we do get a little touch of the old Jane after the aunt refuses to kiss her and reciprocate and forgive her completely. We will see a little trace of the old Jane. It goes something like this. I approached my cheek to her lips. She would not touch it. She wouldn't kiss me. She said I oppressed her. Okay, by leaning over the bed, you're too much for me. Okay, go. It's too heavy, and again demanded water. As I laid her down, for I raised her and supported her on my arm while she drank, I covered her ice cold and clammy hand with mine. Okay, she took her hand, but the feeble fingers shrank away from my touch. She pulled away. Aunt Reed pulled away her hand. The glazing eyes shunned my gaze. She wouldn't look at Jane. So at this point, Jane shows a flash of her old self when she says, "Ja, mo takusan," basically. Love me then or hate me, as you will. Skina yoni. You have my full and free forgiveness. Ask now for God's and be at peace. And she's sort of showing her irritation. Look, I've done my best here. If it doesn't work, I'm sorry, So we get a little taste of the old Jane coming in there. But basically, she has done what Helen would have wanted her to do. She has grown up into the kind of person that Helen hoped she would grow up into. So why am I telling you all this? Because, as I say, I think it could help you when you're writing your term paper to pick on something like this. Because it's a matter of disagreeing. Just let me go through one or two more details and I'll show you what I mean. Firstly, years after Helen's death, she puts up a grave. We assume that it's the gravestone is put there by Jane because it says her grave is in Brocklebridge churchyard. For 15 years after her death, it was only covered by a grassy mound, but now a grey marble tablet marks the spot, inscribed with her name and the word resurgam, which in Latin means I shall arise, I will rise up. So who would have put that grave there? Who would have paid for a gravestone? She's an orphan, Helen. She had no family. No one else would remember her. So we have to suppose that it's Jane herself, probably Jane herself, who's paid for the headstone in memory of her childhood friend. Even if that's not so, even if it's not supposed to be Jane, it's not clear in the novel, even if it isn't Jane who paid for the headstone, at the very least, she values Helen. She visits her grave years later. She remembers her all through her life. So even if she has, I think we're probably supposed to assume that it's Jane who pays for the grave, but even if that's not the way to read it, she obviously values Helen all through her life. So, yeah, let me try and bring this to the point. The point is that you get some critics, like, for example, Benvenuto, in an essay, The Child of Nature, The Child of Grace, and the Unresolved Conflict of Jane Eyre. And Benvenuto's argument is that Jane is not particularly influenced by Helen. He says Jane argues for self-assertion as opposed to submission. Jane argues for the value of earthly love as opposed to the glory of the hereafter. All right? He pits Jane and her passion against Helen. Shows the contrast and emphasizes those two. Helen is not like Jane. Jane is not like Helen. Jane will never be like Helen. All right, so that's Benvenuto's reading of the text. But then Haller, in the Guise and the Act of Concealment in Jane Eyre, is an example of a critic taking the opposite view, saying, although at first Jane rejects Helen's way of thinking, sorry, that should be thinking, not thinking, she later adapts her belief system to include forgiveness of those who have been cruel and unjust. So Haller says, yeah, at first Jane doesn't accept Helen's way of thinking, but Haller's reading of the book is that it's showing Jane becoming more and more of a kind of Christian person who accepts the teaching of the Bible. Well, if you look at what I've written what I've talked about in this presentation, then it's pretty clear that my conclusion is going to be that I agree with Haller, and I don't really agree with Benvenuto. She remembers Helen at the time of her aunt's death. That would be one argument. She puts up a graveyard for Helen many years later. That would be another argument. As she forgives her aunt, I think I should have put that up there. That's another argument. They're all arguments for saying, well, actually Benvenuto's wrong, and Helen does have a big influence on Jane, as Haller argues. So basically, we've got a kind of disagreement among critics. I look into the story, I analyze it as deeply as I can, I research it as much as possible, and I end up agreeing with one side of the debate. On the other hand, I haven't finished the presentation. What I wanted to do up to this point, in fact, I'll go back, I'll take that out again. What I want to do at this stage is to make the point that when you're writing your term paper, if you do the same sort of thing, if you try to find some kind of debate, so some critics are saying this and some critics are saying this. They're arguing different sides of the story or of the text or the situation, the history. It applies as much to history, History is not just facts. History is how people understand those facts. All right? So something like the Reformation, obviously Catholic historians are going to see it differently from Protestant ones. Okay? And a lot of aspects of history are strongly debated. So you can have the same kind of argument relating to the history and the society, or about a literary text. But if you try to make your paper work in that kind of way, so that you're arguing for some sort of debatable topic, all right, that's the better way to approach your paper. Otherwise, you're just giving information which is, that's what you get on Wikipedia. That's what you get, on websites and things. It's your analysis. It's your looking at the debate and deciding which side of the debate you think is right or wrong. That's what really works for an academic paper. Okay, so moving on then a little bit. I just wanted to kind of make a few more comments about the book. Although she gets more kind of Christian in a certain sense as the book continues, it's not really easy to read the whole novel as sort of Jane becoming a Christian. That's not really what the novel shows. It's not what it's about. It's not a tale of conventional piety. There were lots of novels like that show a little girl growing up to be a good Christian, or a little boy or somebody who does something naughty and then learns how to be a good Christian or something. There were lots of moral tales like that. But Jane Eyre isn't really one of them. In fact, when it was first published, quite a lot of people criticised it, feeling that it was disrespectful towards religion, that it wasn't, so far from being a story of religious morality, it was actually disrespectful towards religion. And here I think a topic that would be very sensitive to the Victorians, bigotry as against piety. Piety is being holy. Piety is kind of accepting God and believing sincerely. Bigotry is being a hypocrite. A religious hypocrite in particular is called a bigot. Okay, but a bigot could be a hypocrite of different kinds, but very often used for a religious hypocrite. And in the second edition, she actually comments on the reactions that critics have had. She feels it's necessary to say something that she wants to say, look, I wrote the book, I wanted to make protests against bigotry. And some of my characters, in particular that Mr. Brocklehurst, who's talking to little Jane at the beginning, the one who's the treasurer of the school and has an important position at the school, in particular, she uses him to attack bigotry, to attack hypocrisy. And a lot of my readers, some of these critics, every time I attack religious hypocrisy, they think I'm attacking religion. I'm not. I want to attack the Gesellschaft. I don't want to attack the religion. I want to attack the hypocrites. All right? So mostly it's to do with that portrayal of Mr. Brocklehurst, the way that he's shown. She doesn't apologize. She doesn't say, I'm sorry if for the way that I wrote it. She continues to say, I believe I'm right here. Conventionality is not morality. Self-righteousness is not religion. To attack the first is not to assail the last. To pluck the mask from the face of the Pharisee is not to lift an impious hand to the crown of thorns. Attacking those religious hypocrites is not the same as attacking the religion itself. But Victorian England was a time when I think it would be fair to say there was a lot of hypocrisy in the society. Okay, hypocrisy was accepted. In another class we were talking about there would probably be about, in London, one prostitute for every 40 adults. Is that something like every 40 or 50 adults, adult males, there would be a prostitute, meaning that the Victorian idea, we're a good family society. Actually, with that number of prostitutes, most of them clearly were not. They must have been hypocritical. So the society had a lot of hypocrisy kind of ingrained into it. And here's Mr. Brocklehurst. And this is the one that, the character that she really attacks. He's exposed as a total bigot, a total hypocrite. In one passage, he criticises the school superintendent, a very kind and good woman called Miss Temple, for giving the children little luxuries like bread and cheese. Well, bread and cheese, you wouldn't think it's a luxury now, would you? But the children got porridge every day. Porridge, you know, otomugino. It's kind of very simple, cheap food. And she gave them bread and cheese. Okay? And he insists that they have to be dressed plainly. They have to have their hair cut short. He's saying all of these things, and he's saying it because I have a master to serve, whose kingdom is not of this world. I am a servant of God. My mission is to mortify in these girls the lusts of the flesh. I want to kill their bodily desires so that their souls will go strong and they'll go to heaven. To teach them to clothe themselves with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with braided hair and costly apparel. I teach them how to be modest and by suffering, this whole idea that I will make them suffer so that they will go to heaven. All right, going back to that kind of stuff that we were talking about from the early modern period. It's still there. And then, in the middle of saying all of this, what happens? His daughters arrive. And what are they? They're splendidly attired, according to the novel, in velvet, silk, and furs. Something like that. Okay? So, in the middle of him saying how the girls in the school have to be dressed in a very simple way and have their hair cut short and eat only porridge, and here come his own daughters. Okay, that's Gizeng, clearly. If he really believed that was the best way to get to heaven, he would have his own daughters do the same thing. But no, no, no. All right, here's the description of them. The two younger of the trio, fine girls of 16 and 17, had grey beaver hats, then in fashion, shaded with ostrich plumes, just like in the picture here. And from under the brim of this graceful headdress fell a profusion of light tresses, okay, the curls of the hair. You can see them. The elder lady was enveloped in a costly velvet shawl trimmed with ermine, and she wore a false front of French curls. So absolutely not the way that those poor girls in the school have to dress. Brocklehurst's Christian mission to raise the girls at Lowood in a plain, Lowood is the school, in a plain and simple manner, is shown to be hypocritical through this contrast with the way he raises his own daughters. And it's very clear. This is hypocrisy. This is not Shukyo, this is Gizeng. And, but many of her readers at the time couldn't see the difference. If you're attacking Mr. Brocklehurst, he's a man of the church, so you're attacking the church, you're attacking the religion. And then typhus hits the school. And again, this was true in Charlotte Bronte's childhood. There was an outbreak of typhus, and that's what killed off her sister at that school. So she puts into her novel the same thing that happened in real life. And it's Brocklehurst's policies that are to blame for the number of children who die because of the typhus. Semi-starvation and neglected colds had predisposed most of the pupils to receive infection. Okay, because they weren't fed properly, because they weren't kept properly warm, it was especially easy for them to catch the typhus. And as a result, a lot of them died. Okay? And as she says, but now Mr. Brocklehurst and his family never came near Lowood. Of course they didn't. They're hypocrites. Okay? They don't care for the little girls when they go, because they might catch it. Okay? So, again, just not wanting to attack religion, but attacking the hypocrisy. But again, as I said, it's not necessarily easy for certain Victorian people, or even for certain religious people maybe today, to see the difference. But the difference is made very clear in the novel through another character called St. John Rivers. Whereas Brocklehurst is a hypocrite, St. John is he's a very different kind of person. He is rather cold, and he's unemotional, but he is sincere in his Christian belief. Whether we think he's misguided or that there's something wrong with his way of thinking, that's a different matter. He is not being hypocritical. He has the same rule for himself and for his family as he has for everybody else. At the end of the novel, she gets a letter from him saying he's unwell. The news drew from my eyes human tears, yet filled my heart with divine joy. From a human point of view, I was crying, but from a spiritual point of view, I was happy because I knew he was going to his God. She knows he's going to die, and I know that a stranger's hand will write to me next, somebody she doesn't know, to say that the good and faithful servant has been called at length into the joy of his Lord. He's gone to heaven. And why weep for this? No fear of death will darken St. John's last hour. His mind will be unclouded. His heart will be undaunted. His hope will be sure. His faith steadfast. So St. John, she has, in the big crisis of the novel, she's realized that the man she's in love with is actually already married. And she's run off kind of frantic. And 2 or 3 days later, she's starving, she's cold, it's raining, and she's got nowhere to go, and she knocks on the house of some strangers, and it turns out that they are her cousins, and one of them is St. John Rivers. And of course, that's one of the weird things that happens in the book, the idea that God is guiding people through their lives. But that's another topic. I won't open that topic today. He is kind of a clear contrast to Brocklehurst. He is equally kind of grounded in his religion, but he's not hypocritical about it. He believes it completely, and he provides the same standard to others as he demands of himself. But Jane is not, if it was going to be one of those religious morality stories, Jane would do as he asks. Jane would marry him, because he asks her to marry him because he's going to go and be a missionary in India. And he feels that having a wife to go with him, he'd be able to do his work so much better. She would support him and everything. But he tells her frankly that he doesn't love her. And that's when, again, Jane's passion comes back in. He proposes to her not because he loves her, but because he thinks she's going to be a good companion for his missionary work. And she is totally against this. And we see her passion flying out one more time in this situation. I scorn your idea of love, she says. I scorn the counterfeit sentiment you offer. And I scorn you when you offer it. So she respects him in lots and lots of ways, but when he talks about love like that, she despises him. She looks down on him. She's not going to follow that Sunao Christian path and be a missionary's wife. That's what makes Jane Eyre very different from those kind of moral stories about a young woman growing up and becoming very Christian. That's not what's going to happen to her. Okay, she rejects him. He's a good man, but I'm not like that. I mean, sonke, but watashi wa chigau. So, okay, just to wind it up then, when she does this, when she rejects St. John and takes Rochester, who's the, I told you, she loves this guy, but he's already married. Well, his wife dies. I won't go into details, but the wife dies, and she marries him. And she's showing that she puts her passions, her feelings first. Not her Christian duty or something, but her passions come first. So really, in a way, that takes me back to the beginning, that little girl who's telling her father that her favourite book was the Bible. You know what I think? I can't prove it, but I think she was just telling her daddy what she thought her daddy wanted to hear, not what she really thought. What she really thought, I think, is what she put in the book. I like the bits of the Bible that tell stories, but the rest of it is just boring. Okay, I think that's the real Bronte. So Jane and Bronte, in the end, they respect the Bible. That's their society, and they respect truly religious people. But in the end, they're guided by their feelings and their passions, not by religion. So that's my reading of the text. That's how I look at the story. All right. Okay, that's it.